Hey guys, so I got this awesome new book, Recovery from Lyme Disease Integrative Medicine Guide by Daniel Kinderlehrer. And this is an amazing book. And not only does it sum up Lyme disease, but it goes into depth and explains well so many other chronic health issues. So it just talks about all of the things that are connected with mystery illness, Lyme, and other tick-borne infections. So it goes into detail with the endocrine disruption, gastrointestinal issues, nervous system disorders, inflammation, detox, diet and nutrition, fatigue. So I wanted to break this down and talk about some of these in depth over a course of a few videos, because what's really interesting is in this book, it talks about how if you've been diagnosed with mystery illnesses and mystery symptoms, especially MS in particular, which I think a lot of us have had a question of ruling out MS and then later found out we had Lyme or Bartonella, Babesia, any of these co-infections. He talks a lot in this book about how it's confused or often misdiagnosed. So what I wanted to talk about today is in chapter 15, he talks about endocrine dysfunction. And he shows where the endocrine and pituitary glands, how all of that goes together. And I really, reading through this, thought a lot about our brain retraining videos and how we think about that HPA axis with the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenals. So a lot of us also have heard about adrenal fatigue. And so this book explains, the hypothalamus's job is to then release hormones that triggers the pituitary, which causes changes with different, neurochemicals and transmitters through our reproductive, bones and tissues, thyroid, adrenal cortex, skin, hair, immune system, smooth muscles, kidney. And this is our central switchboard, he calls it in this book. So what happens is the hypothalamus coordinates our endocrine function by secreting hormones to the pituitary, which then regulates our endocrine system. So again, this HPA axis, which we know plays a lot into chronic illness, where we have the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the adrenal cortex, and then that leads to the release of cortisol and DHEA. And if there's negative feedback, it comes back up to the hypothalamus, and it keeps going down. So if you think about when we're under a lot of stress, the hypothalamus secretes this corticotrophin releasing hormone down through the pituitary, which then triggers this release of ACTH, which travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex, and it stimulates this production of cortisol known as the stress hormone and DHEA, which helps really well when it's a situation of acute stress. And this release of catecholamines is short-lived. And that helps us in situations like if you've ever had a stressful situation where you had this adrenaline dump and these catecholamines that actually help you to not feel pain or to feel more strength. But with chronic stress, and this keeps going and going, our bodies aren't meant to live in a state of chronic stress and chronic fight or flight for that long. So the adrenals become enlarged and then they get tired and lose their reserve with low adrenal function. So when you think of that concept of adrenal fatigue, very often no one gets diagnosed. That's considered like a subclinical diagnosis, and it's not diagnosed until someone goes into adrenal insufficiency or Addison's disease. But when you think about the three stages, Hans Sale described the stages of adrenal fatigue in 1936, and he called it the general adaptation response at that time. Stage 1 is the alarm stage with elevated catecholamines, fight or flight, elevated cortisol and DHEA, and decreased resistance to stress. But that happens for a lot of us in our daily life, right? Stage 2 goes into resistance with continued elevated cortisol, DHEA, and an increased resistance to stress. But then stage 3 is exhaustion. And at that point, we have low cortisol and low DHEA and a decreased resistance to stress. So cortisol does help us deal with stress, but over time, low cortisol levels are also going to undermine our immune system's ability to function. So not only will we be in chronic fight or flight mode because of an infection, but then it's a negative cycle because those cortisol and adrenal insufficiency is then hindering our immune system response. So we're even less likely and less able to fight off the infection at play. So some symptoms of adrenal insufficiency they list here would be fatigue, weakness, poor stamina, post-exertional exhaustion, depression, low blood pressure, postural orthostatic symptoms, weight loss, and salt cravings. And they talk a little bit about the labs you can order for this and how to treat our adrenal insufficiency. But what's really interesting too is it shows how this goes a lot into thyroid dysfunction. So how many times did you go to the doctor with fatigue and these mystery symptoms, and they kept saying, we have to test your thyroid, it sounds like hypothyroidism, or maybe you do have a thyroid diagnosis. But this explains that as well, though, because the hypothalamus and it goes down to the pituitary and then the thyroid. So that THS, that thyroid stimulating hormone, comes from the pituitary, and it all stems from that control center of the hypothalamus, and that leads to reverse T3 and T4 and T3, and how that goes into the cell for energy production. But if there's negative feedback from the body being in fight or flight mode, it then comes down and affects this entire thing. So the thyroid, which is also under the control of the hypothalamus and pituitary, plays a lot into our metabolic rate, energy production, and the more that our pituitary is off because of chronic illness, it sends conflicting messages. And it's going to send these conflicting messages to how much TSH we're producing and thyroid hormones in particular. And so they say to think of it as your foot pressing on the accelerator pedal. So low thyroid levels are going to have fatigue, weight gain, heat and cold intolerance, hair loss, and then high levels on the opposite will be agitation, weight loss, sweating, heart palpitations, heat intolerance, tremors, insomnia. So all of this goes into play of how sometimes we have this myriad of different diagnoses, especially in the endocrine system. And he also talks about diabetes, how untreated Lyme and co-infections can lead to diabetes because the endocrine system is the same there. It also talks about infertility factors, insulin resistance, crashing after meals. So what's really interesting is this book says it's all connected, right? So endocrine function is foundational here. So not only does it talk about any chronic illness or disease, but especially something that is so often undiagnosed or misdiagnosed in our culture. And all of it impacts the next thing. So it's not necessarily saying that you don't have thyroid issues or diabetes issues or adrenal issues. It's saying that there's a root cause for all of these things. So if you are one of those people, and then later in the book, he also talks about inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, leaky gut syndrome, SIBO, POTS, sleep disorders, insomnia, depression, cognitive problems, Alzheimer's, MS, Parkinson's, ALS, dysautonomia, immune dysregulation, and even certain cancers, methylation. What's so interesting about all of this is you could be a person who clinically meets the criteria for all of those different illnesses and diagnoses. However, if you are on like 50 different bottles of pills and prescriptions and immune modulators and all of these things because the doctors are chasing down it's diabetes, it's autoimmune, it's lupus, it's MS, but they're missing root cause, right? If we all have, so many of us undiagnosed are walking around, we have Lyme, we have Bartonella, Babesia, Epstein-Barr, just like other providers are talking about, strep and other things that go unrecognized in our system that stay there for years, but especially Lyme. This is the silent epidemic right now. And it can be in your system long enough, especially with stage 3, late stage or end stage Lyme disease, it can be in your system long enough that it probably has caused you to fit the clinical checklist for these other really severe illnesses. But we're then chasing down 15 different diagnoses, 15 different treatments, rather than trying to address what is the root cause. If we healed the Lyme disease, would those symptoms and that clinical presentation of MS go away or resolve? Would we be better able to manage someone who has diabetes or blood sugar issues? Would the adrenal fatigue resolve? So what I find really interesting about this, not only from a Western medical perspective of then being able to address root cause and maybe heal like 15 other diagnoses we have in the process, but from more of our mindfulness perspective and our holistic perspective when we talk about brain retraining, that HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals, the amygdala, the fight or flight response, polyvagal theory with counseling and why mindfulness and mental health factors into chronic health and healing, is it all goes back to this. If our bodies are in constant fight or flight mode from an infection that we maybe don't even know we have, and we're being told that we have all these other diseases and illnesses, it's going to be much harder to heal. So once we're able to identify that there is something like this going on and it is triggering us to be in constant fight or flight mode, we can then also jump back and look at some brain retraining and look at positive psychology and NLP so we can set the stage for healing. Just like we have to set the stage for detox pathways. We have to use things like saunas and herbs and help our liver through our diet, because if we don't have a healthy system in general, mind, body, spirit, overall health, it's going to be much harder to attack and fight and detox these viral and bacterial infections that we may have as well. So I really want to dive a little bit deeper into this series because I think so many people that are, reaching out and asking questions on here are not only wanting the information about the brain retraining from a therapeutic perspective, but they're all like, oh my gosh, I have these mystery symptoms too, right? You go into the doctor and say, yeah, I have all this muscle weakness, I really can't even lift this arm anymore, and my brain fog and my fatigue, it's so crazy. And they rule out Lyme because, right, the CDC is like, yeah, you only have to test for like these 2 strains of Lyme and it's not that, so you're fine. And now it's like 15 years later, they've tested like 5 or 6 times, they found nothing, but they found all of these other indicators of like MS and lupus and diabetes and thyroid issues. Now it's like we can go in and say, well, we know that ILADS and all of these other books and doctors and organizations, and in Europe, they're recommending testing all of these strains now. They're not just saying test for 2. So the more we know about it, and the more we know that maybe these 15 other things we've been diagnosed with all lead back possibly to Lyme, the more we can advocate to get to that root cause for ourselves. So I hope that was helpful. It was a lot of information all at once, but as I was reading this book, I was like, this is groundbreaking. Why don't we talk about this? Why don't more people know about this? Why don't doctors explain this? So I really want to do some more series on this. I want to talk about the MTHFR gene variation, which impairs our detox pathways, which he talks about in here, and then get more in depth in the neurological symptoms too. Sorry, there's really loud cars today. My road is usually not this busy, but I like to just do these informal videos because I'm, first of all, not that good at editing and video stuff, and also just to feel like we're having a conversation. So if that's helpful for you, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any questions, reach out. I also do want to keep focusing on some brain retraining stuff, but in the meantime, getting this information out there. When I first got diagnosed with Lyme and started searching YouTube, about Lyme disease journey or all these things, I'm not finding a lot of people talking about this, especially from a holistic perspective. I am finding many people talking about it from a Western medicine perspective, but once you've gone through the ringer with Western medicine for so long, it's like, no, I need to hear other people who are talking about the newer science and the holistic part of this and what are root causes. So anyway, I hope it's helpful, and I hope you guys have an awesome day full of healing. Talk to you soon.